Welcome, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for joining this session 5 of HJI's International Conference on Peace and Public Leadership, addressing the challenges of our time. The prior sessions have all been stimulating, and I believe this will be equally stimulating, with a great set of panelists to discuss the topic of new religious movements and contemporary threats to religious freedom. I'm very pleased to welcome our moderator and indeed the coordinator who put this session together, Dr. Michael Mickler. He's Distinguished Professor of Historical Studies at HJI. And this is an area of specialization for him, as it is for each of these panelists. Dr. Michael Mickler.
Thank you, Dr. Walsh. Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining the conference and our session. We have, as Dr. Walsh said, an exceptional group of panelists for our session. I don't think I exaggerate when I say they're world-level voices and leaders in the field of religious freedom, and we're honored to have them with us today. But before introducing them, I'd like to go over the format of the session. It will be divided into 3 parts. First, our panelists will speak for 8 to 10 minutes on the topics listed in the program. Then they will join together for a panel discussion, which I will moderate. And thirdly, the panelists will answer questions from you, our online audience. So please post your questions in the chat column, the chat box, and be sure to give your name, your affiliation as appropriate, and or your location, as we have a global audience. It would be interesting to know. Dr. Franco Famularo, our co-moderator, will moderate the chat column throughout the session and present questions to the panelists in that portion. So thank you again for joining us today, and special thanks to the conference organizers. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker. Our speaker, Dr. Katrina Lantos Sweat, is a remarkable person with a remarkable story. She's the daughter of Holocaust survivors, and her father, Representative Tom Lantos, is the only Holocaust survivor to ever serve in the US Congress, which he did for nearly 30 years. Katrina entered Yale University at age 14 and graduated at age 18. Obtained a doctor in jurisprudence and a PhD in history. She's the president of the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice and past chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. She co-chaired the International Religious Freedom Summit 2024 in Washington, D.C. earlier this year. She will speak on the global forecast for religious freedom, stormy skies ahead. Dr. Katrina.
Well, thank you for that very, very gracious introduction. And I am truly honored to be participating in this important event and to be participating with such distinguished panelists and moderators. That's right. The topic of my portion of this session is stormy skies ahead. And actually, as I sit here with you today and look out my window, we are having a pretty major storm in New Hampshire where I live. So it looks like Mother Nature is sort of on board with supporting my thesis. But why this gloomy forecast? I think one would have to say that the facts on the ground show that huge numbers of the world's population, in fact, live in countries where religious freedom is significantly and in many cases egregiously constrained. China, Nigeria, Iran, Russia, North Korea, to name just a few. The annual reports of USCIRF, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, which, as you mentioned, Dr. Mickler, I had the honor of serving on, demonstrate that there are a lot of very big and very significant nations that have been designated as CPCs, or countries of particular concern. And why are they designated as CPCs? Because they engage in systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations of religious freedom. In fact, there are 17 countries that have been so designated in the most recent report of USCIRF. Furthermore, there are an additional 11 countries on what's called the special watch list, which means that they meet two of those three criteria of systematic, ongoing, and egregious religious freedom abuses. So it's a pretty grim picture. And of course, when you factor in countries like China, like Nigeria, the sheer numbers that you're talking about of world citizens who face this kind of repressive environment is really quite sobering. Now, these threats come in a variety of forms. You have, of course, the pervasive state-generated oppression in communist countries, notably places like China and North Korea, where all religious communities are suppressed. All religion is viewed as a dangerous threat to the state control. And the permitted faiths, and I use that sort of in quotes, are all under the strict control of the government. This is where we see the severe persecution of whole communities, groups like the Uyghur communities in the Xinjiang region of China. And in fact, the treatment of the Uyghurs by the Chinese government has been designated as a genocide. The Falun Gong practitioners, the house church movement, all of these come under severe, severe repression. On the opposite pole, you have brutally repressive theocracies, countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia and Afghanistan, where the state-imposed religious order crushes any threat to its religious hegemony, and the government imposes its religious rules on the entire society. Then we have the interesting case of countries like India, the world's largest democracy, where a rising ethno-religious nationalism has led to increasingly problematic laws and practices, and where the environment has frankly become increasingly threatening for religious minorities. We have another category, countries where the governments have been unwilling or unable, or in some cases both unwilling and unable, to quell non-state actors who engage in violence and terror against religious minorities or against those they perceive as threats to their dominance. A clear example of this kind of threatening environment for religious freedom would be Nigeria, where the terror group Boko Haram has been responsible over the past decade or so for some 50,000 deaths, 2.5 million people displaced, and some of the really high-profile atrocities have been the kidnapping of these schoolgirls, kidnapped, raped, and forcibly converted and married off. Interestingly, I've always been somebody who's interested in the origin of terms and names and the etymology behind things. Boko Haram, the name of this well-known, widely known terror group, actually translates as education or Western education is forbidden. And so it gives you a sense of just how antithetical a group like this is, not only to freedom of religion, but any notions of the pursuit of knowledge independently. Another category we can look at where we see this very threatening landscape for religious freedom are countries like Russia, where an authoritarian government has co-opted and corrupted the social influence and credibility of the majority faith to serve the government's goals. I'm thinking, of course, of the way the Russian Orthodox Church has really been drafted, you might say, conscripted, to defend and to advocate and to kind of bless Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. And we have seen this lead to actually a very profound break between the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the Russian Orthodox Church. For a long period of time, the Ukrainian Orthodox Patriarch sort of was under the umbrella of the Russian Orthodox Patriarch. But given this, what is certainly perceived by the Ukrainians as this corruption of the church to serve the ends of the state, we see a break emerging there. Finally, and this is by no means a comprehensive list, but I hope it gives you a sense of the landscape and the reason for that Stormy Skies broadcast. We have countries like Nicaragua, where there has been a slow erosion of democracy, and then suddenly you sort of wake up and recognize that it's gone. It reminds me of the famous little mini quote from Ernest Hemingway's book, The Sun Also Rises, where one of the characters is asked how he went bankrupt. And his answer is gradually and then suddenly. And that's sort of what we've seen in Nicaragua. I think, another analogy that some of you in our listening audience may have heard is of the frog sitting in a pot of water, and the temperature is quite comfortable, but sort of slowly and imperceptibly it's raised by 1 degree, 1 degree, 1 degree. The frog doesn't realize the peril he's in and eventually boils to death because of the somewhat gradual encroachment on him. A symbol, I think, to me, the most powerful symbol of this descent into dictatorship that we see in Nicaragua has been the targeting of the Catholic Church. Again, because it is viewed as a threat to the authoritarian rule of the government and is viewed as a moral voice by the people of Nicaragua. And sort of the really powerful symbol of this has been the arrest and sentencing of the Archbishop of Nicaragua, Bishop Rolando Alvarez, sentenced to 26 years in prison because he refused to go into exile. So one tactic used by the Nicaraguan government has been basically to first arrest, harass, and target their opponents, and then deport them all, basically send them into exile, get them out of the country. And Bishop Alvarez refused to do so and has been rewarded for his act of conscience, not wanting to abandon his Catholic flock in Nicaragua by a sentence of 26 years in prison. So I think that this kind of brief tour of the landscape, if you will, and the various ways and the different kinds of political systems and countries in which we see really alarming degrees of violations of religious freedom helps to explain my forecast of stormy skies. But because we are gathered here today to talk about new religious movements, I think we have to take a moment to consider the case of Japan and its determined assault on the Family Federation for World Peace and Unification. Now, my wonderful colleagues on the panel will address the various legal threats and attacks facing the Family Federation in greater detail, and I'm sure with more substance than I can. But I would like to comment on how troubling and, quite frankly, profoundly undemocratic are the multi-pronged efforts we see in Japan to dissolve and eliminate an entire belief community. This is not how a rights-respecting and confident democracy treats minority faiths. And Japan is perilously close to undermining its claims to be a nation that honors human rights, including, very importantly, Article 18 of the Universal Declaration. Dr. Mickler, you referenced the EARF Summit, where I did appear on a panel where we addressed this. And at that time, I kind of used a popular phrase in culture that friends don't let friends drive drunk, meaning that those of us who view Japan as a democratic ally, an important counterweight to China, can't really stay silent while a country that in many respects does a good job defending democracy, defending human rights, is going seriously, perilously close to running off the rails when it comes to their treatment of the Family Federation. Today, I'd kind of like to invoke another, popular cultural phrase to give a sense of how I view the way Japan is behaving in its targeted attacks on the Family Federation. You've all heard, and I think there might have been a movie by this title, but I have certainly heard the term or the phrase mean girls used to describe those people, those mean girls, if you will, who kind of take the posture that if you're not part of the in-group, if you're not a member of the popular clique, if you're not one of us, then you are fair game for a really reprehensible form of social bullying, or in this case, out and out political targeting. It is just wrong to target a faith community in this way, and it certainly violates the spirit of the Universal Declaration's protections for freedom of religion, conscience, and belief. Of course, every faith community must respect and abide by the legitimate laws of the land where they operate. But no government is justified in targeting and harassing a minority faith or whipping up public sentiment against a minority faith or new religious movement just because they think they can get away with it. And I fear that to some degree, that is what we are seeing unfold in Japan right now. And it's wrong. It's morally wrong. It's politically wrong. And ultimately, it's wrong for the health and the resiliency and the integrity of their own society. Now, yes, I started out talking about stormy skies. And I think my remarks have sort of highlighted, if you will, that gloomy forecast. But I want to say that I remain an optimist. My late father, Tom Lantos, the only survivor of the Holocaust ever to serve in Congress, used to tell me, and this meant a lot coming from a man who had experienced so much in his life. He used to say to me when I was alarmed or disheartened by some circumstances around me in the world, he'd say, "We are just bending a windy corner of history, but around this tough corner will be bright blue skies and wonderful possibilities." And I believe that. Thank you, and I look forward to the remainder of our discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Katrina. You accomplished exactly what I was hoping you would. You sketched out the broad global landscape, and then you zeroed in on a topic of particular interest that Dr. Intravigne will develop more fully in his presentation. So thank you so much. Okay, I'd like to move to our next presentation. Our next speaker, Dr. Eileen Barker. Okay, good. Our next speaker, Dr. Eileen Barker, is Professor Emerita of Sociology at the London School of Economics. She is widely regarded as one of the leading contemporary sociologists of religion and is one of the founders of the academic subfield of New Religious Movement Studies. She is past president of the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion and the Association for the Sociology of Religion. In 1988, she founded Inform, the information network focus on religious movements, which for more than 30 years has provided unbiased information on new religious movements to the media and the public. She will speak on the important topic, how can scholars of new religious movements best contribute to the religious freedom debate? Dr. Barker.
Thank you, Mike. I've just been looking at all the audience and I'm seeing for the first time for 30 odd years some of the people whom I interviewed for my PhD back in the 70s. And some of you have changed a bit and I've changed a bit too. I wish we were live and we could all go coffee together afterwards. I'd have to catch up with at least who's in this country, that is the United Kingdom, and I'm going to chase you up and because I'd love to see what you're up to these days. Anyway, I better get on. Mike has asked me to talk about how can scholars of new religions best contribute to the religious freedom debate? Well, you have to be a social scientist if you're a sociologist and not an advocate. And a lot of the new religions sometimes muddle the two, and we do get muddled. But I do think it's very important as a social scientist to stress that you're a social scientist and not an advocate. And that's the best way you can be an advocate as a social scientist, because as a social scientist, you've got certain potential advantages over the general public because of how you spend your life. And what's quite interesting is that although you might be called as an expert witness, that isn't always terribly useful. I thought when I was first asked to be an expert witness, well, I would say exactly the same, whatever question I'm asked, whether I'm called on this side or the other, and I'm going to be an objective, value-free social scientist. Well, every time I say that phrase, it's very much in inverted commas because you never achieve it. But that is a name that I think is important. And on 2 occasions, I have actually decided to appear against, on the side that was opposed to the religious movement, rather than for the new religious movement, although the new religious movement had asked me to appear for them, because I thought I could be more help on the other side. And in both of those cases, I lost, which meant I won, if you're following me, because I wanted the new religious movement to win. And in both cases, I was able to say good things about the new religious movement that if I had said as a witness on the side of the new religious movement would probably have been dismissed because they'd think, oh, she's just being an advocate. Whereas by saying, well, they do this weakened the case of the people who were against the new religious movement. I hope I made that clear. But I'm just trying to give a sort of taste of how complicated it is if you're a social scientist and you believe fervently in religious freedom. So what are the sorts of things that the social scientist can do? Or how do they get certain advantages in saying that they have a particular way of knowing what a new religious movement is like? And what are the sort of methodologies of social science, which I think are important if we're going to try and combat some of the ignorance and misinformation and indeed disinformation that exists about new religions? One of the things that is very important is the comparative method, putting new religions in context, having a control group, that is comparing. Oh, I forgot to put my thing on, timer. You tell me, Mike, when I'm going on too long.
Me too. I forgot also. So we'll get through.
Well, where was I? Oh, yes, the comparative method. And let me give a couple of examples of that. If you're reading in the papers that a certain cult has committed, a certain cult member has committed suicide, and this is perfectly true, and you read the next day that another cult member has committed suicide, you might start thinking, well, what is it about the cult that makes people commit suicide? However, if you're a social scientist, what you might do is compare the rate of suicide in the new religion with the rate of suicide in the general population, or even better, a population that is matched with the members of the new religions for things like socioeconomic status, etc. And if you find that the rate of suicide is twice that of the new religious movement in the general population, then you might say, well, what is it about the cult that stops people committing suicide? It twists the question round. And this is one of the things we can do by using comparison. Another example, which some of you will know about, I used in my book, The Making of a Moonie. And there, my main argument was that this strange brainwashing that was meant to be taking place, which meant that the Moonies were capable of making people join them and making it impossible for them to leave. In other words, they had a technique which was irresistible and irreversible. This is the theory, and the excuse for deprogramming, which, as I'm sure I don't have to tell you, was pretty horrific. This was the excuse that they had been subjected to this technique. Well, what I found was that those who were subjected to this technique, including myself, 90% said, thanks very much, but we don't want to be a Moonie. And of those who did join the Unification Church, most of them had left within a couple of years. So this meant that the techniques were not all that efficient or effective. And then I found later that the first cohort of the second generation were very much likely to leave as soon as they were able. The second cohort of the second generation didn't. And there are a number of reasons for that, but I won't go into it. The point I want to make is by looking at numbers, seeing the turnover in a new religious movement makes people wonder, well, what is it about a new religious movement that what is it that they resist? And you can ask a whole lot of questions like that. But it was quite obvious that the unification techniques, however much they might have wanted to brainwash people, they just were not very efficient at doing this. So that's just a couple of examples of the way in which a social scientist might be able to make a point that would go against the conventional wisdom.
2 minutes, Dr. Barker.
2 minutes. Okay.
2.5 minutes. Go ahead.
What?
I said 2.5 minutes.
Okay, well, I'll just make, it helps to know why new religious movements are othered, why they're disliked so much. And I think that's something, I won't go into that. We can do it in discussion if you like. But there are a lot of reasons why they would be considered a danger to society and are. One of them is that some of them do bad things, but then that gets generalized and change isn't taken into account. One thing I think that's important and that isn't taught usually in universities is about communication. The social scientist needs to translate how living in a new religious movement, believing the things they do, can make sense. If you just repeat what the member of the new religious movement, him or herself, says, then people don't understand it because you're back to where the problem was in the first place because they're saying that. So the social scientist has to sort of add something to translate, to make it comprehensible so that people could say, oh, now I can see why so-and-so might want to do that. So I think that's another thing that we could discuss in more detail.
In the panel. We can continue in the panel, Eileen. If you could, wrap, please.
Well, I'll shut up now.
Okay. All right. Great. Well, thank you so much. That was very enlightening. And you pointed out a number of approaches that scholars take that can diffuse and debunk even, debunk some of the ideas that are out there. So thank you so much, and we'll continue that discussion in the panel. I'd like to introduce our third speaker, Dr. Massimo Introvigne. He's one of the world's leading authorities on new religious movements and an outspoken activist on religious freedom issue. He truly is a champion in that field. He is the founder and director of the Center for Studies of New Religions, commonly called CESNR, an independent network of scholars, and he is editor-in-chief of Bitter Winter, a magazine on religious liberty and human rights. And I encourage all of you to check out Bitter Winter if you want to be up to date on the latest issues of religious liberty concern. Dr. In'tl will speak on the religious liberty crisis in Japan after the assassination of Shinzo Abe, 2022 to 2024. Dr. In'tl.
Thank you, Mike, and I hope you can hear me. The line is not absolutely perfect in the hotel where I am in Utah, but I would like to start by asking you to do a mental experiment and go back to the morning of July 8, 2022. For us who are in the field of defending religious liberty and studying religious movements, it was a morning like many others. When we woke up, we would know that, as in any other day, believers will suffer for their faith in several parts of the world. Several will go to jail in China or Russia or Iran or North Korea. Some may be tortured or killed, and perhaps devotees of religious minorities will once again be attacked by mobs in Pakistan or Nigeria. But what we surely did not know nor can imagine was that one of the worst religious liberty crises, and certainly the worst in a democratic country in our century, was about to erupt in a most unlikely place, Japan. We all love and admire Japan for its rich culture, religious traditions, and effective democracy. And also in the past, Japan has proved its capacity not to succumb to the emotion. When in 1995, the rogue leaders of new religious movements, Aum Shinrikyo, perpetrated a terrorist attack against the Tokyo subway and committed other crimes, they were identified and punished, but calls that general laws will be enacted punishing new religious movements in general were rejected by politicians and by most Japanese media. The Unification Church, I will use this name for short, even if I know it's now called the Family Federation for War, Peace, and Unification, ran into problem since the 1980s. The real root of these problems was the Unification Church anti-communist political activist and its very effective political activity, which also had electoral consequences. For this reason, in 1987, lawyers mostly belonging to the Socialist or the Communist Party established an anti-Unification Church organization called the National Network of Lawyers Against Spiritual Sales. Spiritual sales was a nickname created by these lawyers to denounce the activities not of the Unification Church as a church, but of a private company called Happy World, whose members were devotees of the Unification Church. And they were selling seals, small pagodas, and other artifacts for very high prices, claiming they will bring good luck or grant advantages to one's relatives in the afterlife. And since they were members of the Unification Church, they donated part of their profits to the Unification Church. And the National Network of Lawyers Against Spiritual Sales used these practices to mount an attack against the Unification Church in general. But again, the Japanese society proved its capability to resist. The National Network of Lawyers called several times for dissolution of the Unification Church and even sued the government on the issue, but its requests were always turned down. And by the morning of July 8, 2022, this was largely a problem of the past. A new law on sales of spiritual items and donations has been passed. The Unification Church has announced its intention of complying with it. The company Happy War no longer existed, and the number of complaints received by the consumer authorities against the Unification Church for incidents recently happened had decreased from hundreds per year in the 20th century to less than 10 in the 21st century and almost to zero by 2022. So in July 2022, there was no Unification Church problem in Japan, no spiritual sales, so-called problem in Japan. These problems had existed in the past and had largely been solved. However, all changed on July 8, 2022, when a man called Tetsuya Yamagami assassinated the Japanese former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. And soon, in murky circumstances, the information was leaked that the motivation of the killer was to punish Shinzo Abe for having been friendly to the Unification Church.
3 minutes,
And,
Dr. Intervigne, you have 3 minutes. We can pick up, if you can't finish everything you wanted to cover, we can pick it up in the panel or the Q&A.
that happened because his mother, the mother of the assassin, went bankrupted 20 years before in 2002, and the killer acted in 2022. This is significant, and we can discuss it later. Rather than blaming the killer, in Japan, the national network was able to launch a huge campaign against the Unification Church, which basically led to 3 consequences. Number one, an action for dissolving the Unification Church, which the government started by changing its own interpretation of the law, which has always maintained that only groups committing crimes could be dissolved, while the Unification Church had only lost some civil case. Number two, a law affecting all religions was passed, severely limiting the possibility of soliciting donations and offering to donors the possibility of recovers their gifts even after many years claiming they had been brainwashed. And third, regulations were passed about children, limiting the possibility for parents to socializing their children in controversial religions, with provisions targeting not only the Unification Church, but also the Jehovah's Witnesses and other groups. In conclusion, what started as a campaign against the Unification Church has now escalated to a campaign which puts religious liberty in Japan in danger in general, as some of the provisions target all kinds of conservative religion. I have defined before what is happening in Japan as the worst religious liberty crisis in the world in a democratic country. I made this statement several months ago, and I should say today that the situation is not getting better. Every day it is getting even worse. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Intravigne. And I would very much encourage those of you online to post your questions for the Q&A session. If you want to know more about the situation in Japan, that will be a good time to address questions specifically to Dr. Intravigne on that. So at this point, thank you all speakers for your very valuable remarks. Now I'd like to proceed to our panel discussion, and we'll have the opportunity to delve further into the theme of the session. So if you could spotlight our panelists, we will join together in a panel. Okay, welcome panel. Wanted to follow up on some of the points that you made, but I also want to bring up one or two new points that may not have been covered. And I want to address the first question to Katrina. You are the daughter of Holocaust survivors, and anti-Semitism has been described as the world's oldest hatred. We've witnessed a rise in anti-Semitism recently, but beyond the present, it always seems to lie just below the surface. Even in the United States, where Jewish people comprise less than 2% of the population, they are victims of more than 60% of religious hate crimes. So I'm wondering, how do you account for continuing anti-Semitism, and how can it be countered? Small questions.
Well, obviously that's a vast topic, one that really extends across the history of certainly the biblically denoted history of the world. And it's obviously a topic that's of great importance to me. You mentioned both of my parents are themselves Holocaust survivors. And, you know, they were both born in Hungary, passionately patriotic Hungarians. And yet with the rise, the resurgence of anti-Semitism in their native Hungary, they became hunted animals by the very same people who had been their friends, their business associates, their schoolmates. And, you know, the whole thing felt, of course, not only unbelievably horrible, but somewhat incomprehensible. And I think a lot of people of Jewish heritage, of the Jewish faith, believed that the ultimate embodiment of the evil that really was the Holocaust might have somehow at last purged, you know, the global, you know, psyche or bloodstream, whatever you want to call it, of this terrible, terrible virus. And it did seem for some decades that even if it hadn't entirely gone away, it had become so delegitimized that it had gone underground. But as you say, Dr. Michler, the last few months have seen an open and virulent reemergence of anti-Semitism, even in places where it was pretty rare until just the last few months. So obviously, I don't have an answer because there is no rational answer one can turn to for something that seems so profoundly irrational in so many ways. You know, the Jewish people, like all people, have their heroes and their villains, their good folks and their bad folks. But writ large, I think it's fair to say that the Jewish people have blessed humanity with extraordinary contributions in the fields of science and math and literature and art and finance and politics. You know, they, for a very, very small community, they have been what is sometimes called in the Jewish tradition, tikkun olam, you know, sort of little vessels of light. And again, no community, no people are without reasons for criticism, but this profound and irrational and untrammeled hatred is hard to understand. And it troubles me deeply as somebody who's very proud of her Jewish heritage. But I do think that, you know, one thing that is different and one thing that has changed is that since the reestablishment of the State of Israel, for the first time in 2,000 years, there is a homeland for the Jewish people. And it is a homeland made up not only of those scientists and artists and others, but also of warriors. And they are prepared to defend their nation and defend their co-religionists wherever they, you know, may reside. And so, you know, right now, I think we're in a very grim and a very disturbing moment. But I think it's also true that a lot of people say, you know, anti-Semitism is kind of a canary in the coal mine. And when it is allowed to run rampant, then other minority and unpopular communities, faith communities, should have their antenna up, because it means that, you know, there is a kind of a danger to all those who are, for whatever reasons, and Massimo just talked about this, easily targeted, easily demonized, easily caricatured. And so in that sense, there should, I hope, be a sense of solidarity among other communities that feel themselves marginalized and mistreated and somehow an easy target. As I said, mean girls, you know, oh, it's okay, we can gang up on them because they're not one of us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Katrina. Very helpful. And building on that, I'd like to turn to Eileen, and maybe Massimo can chip in here as well. And I don't want to get too academic here, but as a pioneer of new religious movement studies, I wonder how you define new religious movements to start with, the origin of the term, how you define it, and whether you're satisfied with that term. Does that term, although it was intended as a corrective, does it nevertheless marginalize groups so designated and set them apart? Is there a better terminology that could be applied, maybe such as minority religions, which then might have commonalities with more established faith traditions, which do find themselves minorities in certain contexts? And perhaps as minority religions, there might be more protections under international law. So I just wanted a brief reflection on just NRM, since that's the topic of our session. Where did it come from?
Well, I remember years ago, Tom Robbins and I think Dave Bromley and I were having a discussion about the use of the term cult, which has a technical use in sociological discourse, but it was being used just to mean bad religion without any particular definition by the anti-cultists. And we were trying to think of some alternative. The Japanese were talking about new religions first, probably. What was his name? Alan McFarlane wrote
Rush
about
Hour of the Gods, or
sorry, the Rush Hour of the Gods.
Right.
Yeah. And then Jacob Needham wrote about new religions as those that had existed for millennia, probably, but were coming to the West, particularly from South Asia. So we decided that we would use that. But then that got into a whole lot of bad water, and it meant you were a cult apologist if you used the word new religious movements. And then people were talking about new religious movements, including Jehovah's Witnesses and old new religious movements. The Japanese started talking about new religious movements, Shimazono. And it got really muddled. Gordon Melton and I had a sort of difference of opinion because he's an historian and I'm a sociologist. So he sees it as being where there is some sort of conflict with the rest of society. I, as a social scientist, use it to mean first generation membership, converts, because you can define that, you can tell very easily, well, fairly easily, actually. I mean, there are problems like the Mormons, which have more converts, although they're, I don't know, 8th generation. But generally speaking, you can tell whether something is a new religious movement if you say it's got a majority of converts. And then a whole lot of things follow from that, or usually follow and can be worked out, which I can tell you if you want. But just to go back to your point about making people othered by using that term, because of that, at Inform, we have gone through various names. We had alternative religions, but that didn't work for obvious reasons. And now we talk about minority religions. And that's the term we use if sort of pushed to say, what do we study? And also, of course, a lot of the new religions that were new religions when it was set up are no longer new religions.
Thank you.
But I still think it's a useful term if you use it as one where there are predominantly first generation membership.
Got it. Thanks. And to Massimo, I'm wondering whether you regard threats to new religious movements, let's use that term, today to be more serious, less serious, or about the same as threats to NRMs during the so-called cult wars of the 1970s to the 1990s. And you might think about the role of the internet and social media here, which wasn't a presence in the earlier period. But I wonder whether the situation's worse, better, or pretty much the same. That's A. And B, you're known for your encyclopedic approach to new religious movements. And if you could just very briefly just tick off, you did a case study of the Family Federation. I'm wondering if you could briefly tick off other case studies of NRMs, religious liberty crises that you could have chosen for case studies if you had decided to. So A, what's the situation? B, could you tick off a few other examples for our audience?
Yeah, we can have a full conference on this, but very briefly, I believe we are going back to the times of the cult wars, but not everywhere. The main example is what happened just 2 days ago in France. France in 2001 tried to pass a law criminalizing cults practicing brainwashing. But after the objections of scholars, which were perhaps less important, and of the Constitutional Court, which were perhaps more important, they went back to mental manipulation. Then the Constitutional Court said not good enough. And so they passed the Abu Picard law, which incriminate the abuse of weakness, abus de faiblesse. Then after many years, they realized they had not captured many new religious movements, particularly they lost their main cases about what in 2001 they regarded as their two main targets, the Jehovah's Witnesses and Church of Scientology. And so 2 days ago, finally they passed the new law where they go back to something they called psychological subjugation, which is really brainwashing. And it has two differences with abuses of weakness. First, the person should not be weak. everybody can be a target of psychological subjugation or subjection. And number two, it is not needed, as it was in the 2001 law, that the victim of psychological subjection causes harm to herself. It is enough that there is a deterioration in their mental health, but according to the governmental anti-cult agency Miviludes, being part of a cult involves a deterioration in the mental health. So we are very much back to 2001. And of course, in Japan, we are back to the 80s, when the national network launched this campaign against the Unification Church. But that's not happening everywhere, even if we see the Unification Church case in Japan quoted in countries such Italy or Germany, or even Kenya or South Africa to pass anti-cult legislations. But I believe some landmark criticism of the brainwashing hypothesis and the notion of cult has been established by both the US courts and the European Court of Human Rights. So what we saw as this deteriorating situation for new religious movements is so far localized in a few countries such as France and Japan, and of course it never went away in totalitarian regimes such as China or Russia. In terms of the most targeted movements, I believe globally another movement which is targeted in many countries is the Jehovah's Witnesses. We can call it a new religious movement, an old new religious movement, a religious minority. Of course, its opponents, including the French government, simply called it a sect, which should be translated as cult and not as sect. And in Japan, a set of actions against Jehovah's Witnesses have just been started. I'm an expert witness in this case, together with my colleague Holly Falk from Western Washington University. So the Jehovah's Witnesses are next also in Japan. And of course, they are banned and have been liquidated, all their property confiscated, many of them put in jail in Russia, but they are attacked also in several democratic countries, including Spain right now. And so Jehovah's Witnesses would have been an excellent case study we could have proposed today. But of course, there are several others too.
Great, thank you. And again, please, audience, if you have further questions about the case study that Massimo dealt with, please save them for the chat. One final question before we go to the Q&A and from the online audience. And I'd like to ask Katrina, what grounds for optimism are there in looking at the global landscape for religious freedom?
Well, I did use my father's wonderful phrase about bending a windy corner of history. And, you know, when you're going around that windy corner, you pull your hat down low, you pull your coat a little tighter. And it does sometimes feel that that's what those of us who are active in this religious freedom space need to do. But I do see signs of optimism. One is that an increasing number of countries are following the United States lead in establishing a role similar to our ambassador at large for religious freedom. So over a quarter of a century ago, the United States Congress passed the International Religious Freedom Act, which was really the first time a major country, to my knowledge, first time any country had, as a matter of law, put the protection of religious freedom as a priority for the government, in our case, in terms of our foreign policy, because there wasn't really a focus on domestic religious freedom. It's focused on international religious freedom, linked the defense of this fundamental value to a whole range of other social benefits. And we know from research done by Pew and by others that countries that do a good job of robustly protecting freedom of religion, conscience, and belief tend to do pretty well on the other things we care about, on democracy, on pluralism, interestingly, on higher socioeconomic status for women in those societies. So, you know, the United States is committed to defending this right globally. And we do see more and more countries sort of also coming on board. You have the International Religious Freedom and Belief Alliance. You have the coalition of parliamentarians, international parliamentarians defending freedom of religion and belief. So I do think there is some movement generally among good governments to bulk up, to bolster, to strengthen their infrastructure, if you will, their diplomatic infrastructure in this regard. I would say, and I'm not here to promote it, but I would say that the annual Earth Summit, which is an initiative led by my dear friend and colleague, Ambassador Sam Brownback, who was our ambassador at large for religious freedom in the Trump administration, that this is sort of a tip of the spear in terms of a growing movement to bring together practitioners, academics, religious leaders, victims of religious persecution in a very powerful convening event annually. And we've been enormously grateful for the strong support from the Family Federation. The Washington Times has been a tremendous backer of this initiative. And it's really very exciting to see the collaborations, the networking, the force multiplier ways in which we sort of can move this cause forward. So I think there are positive signs. It's not enough. It's nowhere near enough. And I actually think that one of the challenges we have is that because, and this is true in the United States, I'm sure it's true in Japan, it's true in France, it's true in England, it's true in, a lot of countries, that the foreign policy professionals, for the most part, I'm not sure they're on board. They want to deal with sort of relations with other countries on the basis of economics, political structure, a variety of other criteria. And we haven't yet, to my satisfaction, persuaded them that to the extent we use our influence, our leverage, and yes, our pressure to increase the space for freedom of religion, conscience, and belief, we are going to help our interlocutors. We're going to help the other countries we deal with build stronger, more resilient, more rights-respecting societies. Everybody does better when people's most fundamental conscience beliefs have a measure of protection and respect in societies.
Great. Well stated. Thank you so much. And a point of optimism for me is that the models that both Eileen and Massimo initiated with Inform and Sesner, which did bring together practitioners and scholars and interested parties, is now somewhat penetrating into the world, the zone of more established human rights and religious freedom areas. And so I see that collaboration starting to coalesce, and that's a sign of great hope to me. All right, so that will wrap up our panel. Thank you so much. I'd like to invite in Dr. Famularo at this point, who has been monitoring the questions and comments on the chat. Thank you. Dr. Famularo.
Thank you, Dr. Mickler, and thank you, Drs. Introvigne, Barker, and Lanto-Sweat for such excellent presentations. And also to our 116 participants this morning who are here from all over the world, from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America, from Europe, I see many familiar names and some unfamiliar, and you have been very engaged because I have a pile of questions, and unless we extend the session until 2 o'clock New York time, we won't get through them, but we'll do our best. So I'll try to combine some of these. So first of all, Dr. Int'l, we live at a time where liberal democracies are challenged by forms of populism or nationalism. Do you believe threats to religious freedom are growing at this time as a result of growing populism and nationalism? Or are these threats due to globalist and universalist views of the good society? And it's clear that it's not just minority or new religious movements that are under attack, but religion as a whole. I'm sure that your background in Italy will inform you that the Catholic Church itself is under a lot of attack, not to mention many others. Dr. Int'l.
Yeah, I will answer in the same time my question I see from Mr. Keisuke Noda because in the chat, because it touches on very similar topics. When I serve as the representative of Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe for combating racism and religious intolerance, I had some friendly discussions with my American colleague. I am a great admirer of the American model, but I do not believe the American model will function everywhere in the world. For instance, in Italy, which has a better record on religious liberty than some of our neighbors, particularly France, the Constitution explicitly recognized the historical role of the Catholic Church in Italy, and only the Catholic Church can have a concordate, the others have intese. Or in countries like Georgia, which I visited twice, I was always told that it will be inconceivable to have a constitution putting other religions on the same situation as the Georgian Orthodox Church, which created the nation. And I can give many other similar examples. So we will never persuade a number of countries to adopt the American models and to say that all religions are equal, because there are countries, particularly in the Muslim world, where 99% of the population belongs to one religion. And this religion inspires the constitutions and the laws and the way of living in a very deep way. So we should seek other models which will also accommodate the prevailing return to forms of defense of identity in a world troubled by wars and pandemics and the loss of identities and whatnot. We should propose other models where some countries would be allowed to reaffirm their historical connection with one religion, which, for instance, will be mobilized in the case of funerals of the king or the president. I will see as inconceivable to have an interreligious funeral for the King of Morocco, while there could be one for the King of England, but not for the King of Morocco. That will not be accepted in Morocco. And so this model we should propose is not a one-size-fits-all, but models which will accommodate the national context. And allow some countries to recognize the historical role of a certain religion, while, and that's the important point, granting the freedom of religion or belief enshrined in international treaties to everybody. What is important is that everybody is granted the basic religious liberties as enshrined in Universal Declaration of Human Rights, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, And if some countries today, also under the impulse of a strong identitarian movements, want to give or to keep a special role for an historical religion, I believe we should live with it and not believe that one single model, which gave such admirable results in the history of the United States, can simply be exported to, say, Morocco or Bhutan or even Italy, for that matter.
Well, thank you, Dr. Int'l, for such a comprehensive answer. And I'm sure that there are many more questions. I should mention that the initial question came from the HJI president, Dr. Thomas Walsh, and similar questions also from Dr. Kittle, based in the Philippines, and Dr. Ward, the provost of HJI. Now, I'd like to move to Dr. Sweat. You have a question here from a lawyer in Japan, Kondo. Mr. Kondo asks, please let me know on what points you think Japan is violating religious freedom on its activities to dissolve the Family Federation. Consider the following reasons. The government changed the interpretation of what would allow a church to be dissolved or a faith community to be dissolved. The government only listened to apostates. The government only is trying to dissolve the UC on political reasons, and that leftist lawyers have been mobilizing mass media to persistently attack the Family Federation. What reasons do you see that Japan is violating religious freedom in its activities to dissolve the Family Federation?
Well, it's a very good question. And of course, Massimo is much more of an expert than I am, but my initial instinct is to say all of the above. In the United States, in our legal tradition, something that is referred to as a bill of attainder, when the government, and this goes back to English common law, when the government creates sort of a legislative, law-based mechanism to go after a specific target, not a law devised for society as a whole, but very clearly and kind of transparently intended to attack, dismantle, dissolve, destroy one particular target, it should violate everybody's sense of justice. That is not how the laws are intended to be used. To pick an unpopular target and then say, we're going to use the cloak of legality to destroy them. So, I wouldn't necessarily pick any one of those. I don't want to hold myself out as an expert. As I say, Massimo is able with much more specificity to address the concerns. But you don't need to be an expert to understand that the arrays of tools that are being directed against one target, both the demonization through media caricatures, as the questioner indicated, the harvesting of the most alarming stories from people who are no longer affiliated with that organization, who have a beef, who have concerns, and of course, who should have the right to pursue any actual legitimate legal complaints through legal means. But all of these techniques, I think, violate the fundamental idea behind defending religious freedom, which is that the conscience rights of all groups should be protected and should be treated equally by the law. And so I as I said, I think Japan is on shaky ground here. And it is not treating this one particular community of belief in a way that any other community of belief would want to be treated. And, I was asked earlier about sort of the terrible anti-Semitism that my family encountered. There's a really powerful and memorable prayer that I attributed, I want to say, to Pastor Niemöller. I mean, it may be familiar to some of your listeners, and forgive me if I don't quote it precisely, but the gist of it is, first they came for the Jews, and I was not a Jew, so I said nothing. Then they came for the Catholics, and I was not a Catholic, so I said nothing. Then they came for the trade unionists. I was not a trade unionist, so I said nothing. And in the end, this prayer or this commentary ends by saying, then they came for me, and there was nobody left to speak for me. That is why, whether one is Jewish or not, whether one is a member of the Family Federation or not, or Jehovah's Witnesses who have been brought up a couple of times today, there needs to be a spirit of solidarity based on our shared fundamental right as human beings to live our lives in accordance with our deepest conscience convictions. And when we shrug our shoulders or turn away from a targeted community because it's not us, or we may disagree with their beliefs, shame on us. And when they come for us, there will be no one left to speak for us. So that's where I think the solidarity of the international religious freedom movement has to be manifested. We stand for the conscience rights of others in hopes that they will stand up for ours.
Thank you for that, Dr. Sweats. I mean, this is clearly what all religions are facing everywhere right now, more than ever. And I'm glad that you referred to Niemöller's famous quote that there may not be anybody to defend anybody in the end. This brings me to ask Dr. Barker a question. I was going to ask you earlier, Eileen, but I saw you were coughing. I hope you've recovered by now. Everything's good. Thank you. So, you've been engaged in this effort since the 1970s, and I was one of those that completed your survey back in 1978.
Thank you.
But what threats to new or minority religious movements have you witnessed? Is it more serious in the 21st century, or was it worse in the decades prior to here? And what lessons can we learn from the past that can be applied today?
It's different. It's different. There are different fears. There are different contexts. Lots of things don't happen at the individual level. For example, you don't get brain deprogramming in the way that you did in the 70s, which was done without anybody objecting, really. It was just sort of taken for granted. Now it's far more the state is a danger. What's happening is that there is the labeling, not just of cults, but of the Xizhao in China, which means unorthodox heresy or something like that, which is translated as evil cult. There's the extremists in Russia. And once a religion is labeled that way, this gives the state permission to treat it not as a religion. I got into trouble in China, mainland China, for calling Falun Gong a religion. And it was explained to me that it wasn't a religion, it was a Xizhao, and part of the list, like the list they have in France. And that meant it was not a religion, so it wasn't subject to religious freedom and the rights of a religion. And similarly, in Russia, if you're labeled or your literature is labeled as extremist, this means that you are criminal, and just by definition, by the labeling. So I think that's something that has happened. It's getting more systematic at thing is in Britain. I would say that we're pretty free. There are problems, but the Northern Ireland situation meant that we introduced laws that forbade certain movements because they were terrorist in Northern Ireland. And there were a few that were labeled terrorist organizations, therefore weren't subject. Now, that was okay. Nobody likes terrorists. But what happened was that this meant that the door was open to saying you're defined in one way, and therefore you're not subject to religious freedom. So religious rights and religious freedoms are taken away in a whole lot of ways like that. But on the other hand, there are reasons for hope, I think. People will say, even if they don't do it, that all people are equal. It isn't acceptable to behave in the sort of way you did in calling people racist names, LGBT people, sexual discrimination, gender discrimination. All these things are discussed. They're not all solved, but they're discussed, and there's an awareness that there wasn't 50 years ago, where it was just taken for granted that, at least in a large number of societies, that certain types of people were inferior. Now you may still believe it, and you may still try and do something about it, but you'll be challenged, I think, far more because of the work people like Katrina and her organization, and people like Massimo, who's a fantastic advocate for new religions. It's people can't get away with it so easily, but it isn't getting all that much better because there are new ways being found of taking people's freedom away.
Well, thank you for that, Eileen. Yesterday the Prime Minister of Japan spoke to the Congress of the United States, and I read part of his speech, and part of it had to do with upholding values such as freedom and more. Given that he spent a good time of his life, a good portion of his life, or a short portion of his life, in New York City, and he did support the Mets, and we'll forgive him for that. And he did have hot dogs at Coney Island and more, but it seems that right now in Japan, the situation is such that it's open field to attack, and they've been silenced by the media. None of the opinions of people as illustrious as yourselves is getting into the Japanese community. And this relates to that. So one of the questions that was asked earlier, what should a new religious movement do to best counter state-sponsored attacks? Case in point, the Family Federation in Japan. This is asked by Robert Kittle, who's based in the Philippines and is a senior advisor to the Family Federation there. Maybe Katrina, you want to tackle this one?
Yeah, sure. It's a very, very big challenge. And I think that, one of the best ways, I think, would in fact be to bring international pressure from Japan's allies, that it considers to be its allies. And getting that to happen is hard. I have great respect for our ambassador for religious freedom, Rashad Hussain, and have, reached out to him just to raise this question of Japan's straying from its own values in this targeted and coordinated attack on the Family Federation. I think it's one of the frustrating things that very often for religious freedom causes in general, they have a hard time getting prioritized by our government. And certainly, when we look at some of the absolutely horrific religious freedom abuses going on globally, and I talked about some of those in my opening remarks, it's easy for an issue like this to just drop further down on the priority agenda. I think that, and I think probably you've had this experience too, Massimo, that when you have a chance to talk to somebody like the ambassador at large or, the Secretary of State about this issue, they say, yeah, that's a problem. That's a concern. That shouldn't be happening. But, when you have communities facing very, very grave threats to their, physical survival and well-being, it can be hard to push an issue like this to the top of the agenda. But I think that, I need, speaking for myself, this may not be true of anybody else on this panel or in the viewing audience, but I know I don't feel like I have yet mastered the tools of social media and how to use that potentially very powerful force to push back, to create a counter narrative, to tell a story. It's a world that the people of my generation are not as comfortable with. We're not native to that milieu and that environment. But I think that social media holds both great potential and great danger. We know it's an environment in which misinformation, false narratives can get a lot of traction. But we need to become better at figuring out how the good guys can marshal those tools to change a false narrative, to correct misinformation. So I think, the political actors, the diplomatic actors, the media actors, social media influencers, all of these tools need to be brought to bear. And then, of course, certainly in this country, the courts. Jehovah's Witnesses have been brought up a couple of times. I teach a course on religious freedom, international religious freedom at Tufts University. And one of the things that I think is always surprising to my students, particularly when we talk about religious freedom traditions in the United States, is the number of key religious freedom cases that were brought and won by Jehovah's Witnesses in the U.S. constitutional context. Now, this is a faith community that really, holds itself at a distance from politics, from engagement in sort of the political and public life of the countries in which they live, which is why places like Russia like to label them extremists. But in the United States, they very intelligently have taken advantage of our constitutional system of laws to go to court and say, we're going to defend our rights. And a lot of key cases have been won by Jehovah's Witnesses. So when you have a robust rule of law system, if you have robust constitutional protections, that can be a very important avenue for vindicating rights, even when popular opinion is against you. And, in our courts have often vindicated rights against the popular temper of the times. I don't know enough, and Massimo, you're much better able to answer that, and maybe you can jump in. I don't know how robust the constitutional protections are in the Japanese system. I don't know what the odds are, for example, that the Family Federation can ultimately vindicate rights that the political process is seeking to crush, and maybe you will be able to elucidate.
Well, thank you for that, Dr. Sweat. And Dr. Int'l, I was going to ask you next because I actually started 4 minutes later than I was supposed to. So you come from the country where turning the other cheek was practiced very early on in the history of Christianity. And one of our professors at HJI, Dr. Ward, is asking, what advice would you give to a minority or new religion that finds itself dismissively stereotyped by unfounded rumors and treated with disrespect, etc.? You know a lot about that because you've dealt with many different groups, I know, small, medium, and large. How do you deal with that, and how would you respond? I know that social media has been effective for many people in promoting many different things. So, Massimo, you've got the final word.
Yeah, I believe the key point is that for the opponent of these religions, they are not religions at all. They are, as the new French law calls them, bande organisée, criminal conspiracies. And Eileen and I both have had the experience of dealing with the Chinese, and I have had the experience of dealing with the Russians too. And when I was at the OSCE, I was, in my capacity, they had to receive me at the Mivilude. And I believe the main theme is always the same. For these people, the Unification Church or the Church of Scientology or the Jehovah's Witnesses, they are not religion at all. So they can say, we uphold and defend religious liberty for real religions, but these are not religions. These are cults or HJI or extremist groups practicing brainwashing. And that's the long and the short of the new French law, but that's the long and the short of the Japanese attitude. The Unification Church and now the Jehovah's Witnesses are not religions. They are criminal conspiracies which use mind control to enslave victims. And if members of the Unification Church or the Jehovah's Witnesses come forward to testify, what they say is irrelevant because they are under brainwashing. So what they say just proves that brainwashing is very effective. So many years ago, I believe Eileen Barker had debunked the theory of brainwashing once and for all, and that was part of our past. We can just quote her and some footnotes to her work by Jim Richardson and perhaps myself for the European continental situation. But it appears that there is a strong comeback of brainwashing under any other name. In France is psychological subjection or subjugation. So unfortunately, we should fight now this battle for the second time and debunk what is the basic myth presiding over the persecution of this group, that there are two categories, the real religions, and they do not use brainwashing under any other name. And then there are the false religions or pseudo-religions, or HJI or extremist group or controversial religions, as the Japanese regulation on children calls them. And these enslave people through brainwashing so that they enslave people when they say we are perfectly okay, we made our free choice. They are not believable because they are sous emprise, as they say in France, or under the mind control of their leaders. So unless we can debunk for the second time, scholars already debunked it in the 20th century, but if we cannot start again and debunk this persuasion, which today is promoted by unlikely social actors such as the human trafficking agencies, because they want to expand the notion of human trafficking to the brainwashed members of cults, not only to the victims of organized crime. That's becoming a big problem in Latin America and Eastern Europe, for example. If we cannot again say that there is no inherent difference on what so-called cults or new religious movements and mainline religions convert their members, we will not win this battle. So welcome to the second cult wars, and let's hope we can win them as we basically won the first cult wars.
Thank you, Dr. Intravigne, Dr. Katrina Lantos-Sweat, and Dr. Eileen Barker. Dr. Mickler, the floor is yours. We're wrapping up here. There's so much more to say. There's so many more questions to deal with. I'm very sorry all of you have had the chance to read about it. Jack Corley, who travels to Russia regularly, tells us that the church is still registered there and free to operate. And may it long continue. And may we actually continue to operate all over the world. And hopefully we can get over all these issues that are troubling all religions worldwide. Dr. Mickler, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Famularo, for handling so adroitly all of those comments and questions in that column. You did a great job, and thank you. And fantastic session. I'm very impressed with the wisdom and experience of our panelists. And particularly, I appreciate the clarity with which they understand and articulate the circumstances of Family Federation in Japan. I think the clarity expressed on that was truly impressive. So we'll have to end our session now. And I thank all of our online audience for joining us today.